What is happiness? Is it having good health, beauty, and regular meals? Even an emperor, who may have all of these, still suffers in countless ways. True happiness lies in self-knowledge. Everything else is fleeting. It passes with time. What is the use of knowing everything about the world if you do not know who you are? Men avoid this investigation into their true selves. But what could be more worthwhile to pursue? What remains to be known when the self, the Atman, is known? To know your true self is to always remain in a state of happiness. Almost all humans are, to some extent, unhappy because they do not know their true self. If the mind is happy, not only the body, but the entire world will feel happy. Therefore, you must discover how to become truly happy. Everyone seeks that which will bring them happiness. Your mind wanders toward external objects because you believe happiness is found in them, but discover where happiness really comes from. Then you will realize that all happiness comes only from the self, and in this realization, you will remain in the self. This is true happiness. What is infinite is happiness. There is no happiness in finite things. There is no happiness in any object of the world. Through ignorance, we imagine that happiness is derived from objects. When the mind moves outward, it experiences misery. In truth, when your desires are fulfilled, the mind returns to its source and enjoys happiness, which is the self. In the same way, in states of deep sleep, samadhi, or fainting, or when a desired object is attained, or an undesirable object is removed, the mind turns inward and enjoys the pure bliss of the self. Thus, the mind moves restlessly, alternating between leaving the self and returning to it. Under a tree, the shade is pleasant. Out in the open, the sun is scorching. A person walking in the sun feels relief when they reach the shade. Someone who keeps moving back and forth between the shade and the sun is a fool. A wise person remains in the shade. Similarly, the mind of one who knows the truth never leaves Brahman. The mind of the ignorant, on the other hand, wanders through the world feeling miserable and occasionally returns to Brahman to experience brief moments of happiness. Do not wander outward, eating the scorching sand of worldly pleasures, which are not the self. Return home, to the heart, where peace shines like an eternal vast and cool shade. Enjoy the feast of the bliss of the self. In truth, what is called the world is merely a thought. When the world disappears, when there are no thoughts, the mind experiences happiness, and when the world appears, the mind experiences misery. All thoughts are suffering, for thoughts pull your attention away from the self, which is pure happiness. Once the mind finds its inner happiness, it will no longer wander outward. The world and its events are merely ideas within you. Ideas exist in the mind, and the mind exists within you. Thus, the world exists within you. Every being in the world longs to be happy. Yet, due to ignorance of the true nature of their own self, which is happiness itself, people struggle in the vast ocean of material existence. What is happiness, if not your own self? You are not separate from the self, which is happiness. At this moment, you think you are the mind or the body, which are mutable and transient, but you are immutable and eternal. This is what you must understand. Happiness is your nature. It is not wrong to desire it. What is wrong is to search for it outside when it is within. Happiness is not something to be attained. On the contrary, you are always happiness. The desire for happiness arises from a sense of incompleteness. For whom does this sense of incompleteness arise? Investigate. In deep sleep, you were happy. Now, you are not. What stands between that happiness and this unhappiness? It is the ego, the false self. Seek the source of the ego, and you will discover that you are happiness. Do not confuse the ego or the idea of the body with the self. Happiness is the very nature of the self. Happiness and the self are not different. Happiness is our natural state. Suffering arises when we leave the self and identify with the body and mind as I. The ego, the thought, I am this body, has been strengthened over many lifetimes. What remains after this thought is destroyed is happiness. What a great gain it is to abandon the ego. The death of the ego is the revelation of supreme bliss. We attain the infinitely vast self, but for this small price, the ego must be paid. Yet, people fear this state. Men do not fear the ego-dominated existence, which is the source of all fear, because they believe this ego is themselves and they do not know the real self. They fear that losing the ego means ceasing to exist. They fear what they should not fear and do not fear what they should. This is ironic because no one fears sleep, and in sleep there is no ego. In the state of liberation, there is no ego, just as in deep sleep. In deep sleep, a person has no possessions, not even their own body. Instead of being unhappy, they are deeply happy. Everyone desires deep sleep. This proves that happiness is inherent to man and does not come from external causes. This happiness of the self is always with you, and you will find it if you seek it diligently. The self must be sought and found by turning away from the world and through introspection. The mind must return to its source. When the mind returns to the heart, it can no longer project worldly appearances onto the self, which obscures it. It is the mind that veils our happiness. You must discover the true nature of the mind. And then you will recognize that there is no mind. When you seek the self, the mind does not appear. By abiding in the self, there is no need to concern yourself with the mind. You are the self, nothing but the self. Everything else is mere imagination. So, be the self, here and now. There is no need to run to a forest or lock yourself in a room. Continue your essential activities, but free yourself from attachment to the one performing them. Whatever means you adopt, you must ultimately return to the self. So why not remain as the self, here and now? Just be the self, here and now. The matrix is complex, but each of us holds a part of the solution. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and together we'll see beyond appearances.